Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Terre, Haute. This congregation welcomes all people, regardless of their age, religion, race, nationality, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or anything else that has been used to divide people. We are a group of people with our own opinions, our own ideas, our own dreams. But we share ideals. We share a common belief in a liberal religion. In our discussions, we may disagree with each other, but we must always remember that what unites us is stronger than what separates us. We must always end the service aware of the love that we have for each other.
Being you, we share each Sunday one of the principles of Unitarian Universalism. The fourth principle for today, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. As responsible religious seekers, we recognize we are privileged to be free, to have resources to pursue life beyond mere survival, to continually search for truth and meaning, to exist beyond bonds of dogma and oppression, and to wrestle freely with truth and meaning as they evolve. This privilege calls us not to be isolated and self-centered, believing that our single perspective trumps all others, but rather to be humble, to be open to the great mysteries of truth and meaning that life offers. And those mysteries may speak to us through our own intuition and experience, but also through tradition, community, conflict, nature, and relationship. Institutionally, we have left open the questions of what truth and meaning are, acknowledging that mindful people will, in every age, discover new insights. Reverend Paige Getty, the UU Congregation of Columbia, Maryland. Today's opening words are number 657. It matters what we believe. Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged.
Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies.
Some beliefs are like shadows, clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities.
Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness.
Some beliefs are diversive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies.
Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern.
Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction.
Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration.
Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness.
Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth.
Some beliefs are rigid like the body of death, impotent in a changing world.
Other beliefs are pliable like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life.
Sophia Leon Fass. Our opening hymn. number 42. Our transitional words are number 658 in the back of your hymnal. To laugh is to risk appearing the fool.
To weep is to risk appearing sentimental.
To reach out for another is to risk exposing our true self.
To place our ideas, our dreams before the crowd is to risk loss.
To love is to risk not being loved in return.
To hope is to risk despair.
To try is to risk failure.
To live is to risk dying.
So I would now like to invite Reverend Bill Breeden to join us to share his words of wisdom as he does so wonderfully. Bill is a retired minister from the UU congregation in Bloomington and has come here many, many, many times, and we're so glad to have him every month.
I'm honored to be here again in Terre, Haute with you. Been doing this since, I don't know, since Custer died. I think it's been a long time. I'm sure all of us remember exactly where we were on 9/11/2001. I've told you before, I've shared it many times in different places. I was in my little cabin in Owen County, Indiana, had gotten up and was reading the Bloomington Herald Times, and on the nation state section of the movie, the headline read, U.S. airstrikes kill 8 Iraqi shepherds. And about the time I was finishing that article, the phone rang and a friend of mine said, turn on your television, some guy just flew into the World Trade Center. And I, like almost all Americans who had access to a television and were not running from the terror in New York and Washington, sat glued to that television all day long. I remember when the first tower fell, the words of Hosea came to me. Hosea chapter 10, verses 10 through 12. Because you've trusted in the size of your chariots and the multitude of your warriors, therefore the tumult of war shall be upon your people, and all of your fortresses will be destroyed. And I've made that statement several times, almost caused a riot at Indiana University when I made it. But the fact is, what happened on September 11, 2001, is a direct response to the violence sowed around the world by an empire that needed awakening. I do not justify that attack, but it is an explanation. America had come to think, and still do, many of them, that the earth is flat, that you could just push violence away, and somewhere it just falls off the edge of the earth. But on September 11, 2001, it circled the earth and came back, just like Hosea said it would, again and again. So on November 26, 2001, this was the cover of the New Yorker. And I saw an interview with Art Spiegelman, who drew that cover. It's a picture of bombs, or of planes dropping turkeys for Thanksgiving on Afghanistan. We have spent, in the 20 years of our war in Afghanistan, we spent $300 million a day. $300 million a day for 20 years. The total cost of that war will end up being, really, it's cost us already $2 trillion, but because it was done on credit, the total cost, Forbes projects, will be $6 trillion for a war that did not have to happen. And I had to ask myself when I saw this cover on November 26, 2001, what would happen if we spent just a scintilla of $6 trillion dropping food in Afghanistan? What would happen if we put our money to feeding the hungry, to housing the people who are homeless? If we put our money to healing nations, to healing our own nation, what would happen? And that's what Art Spiegelman said came to him when he designed this cover of the New Yorker. What difference would it make if we served the people rather than bombed the people? $6 trillion, $300 million a day. That's almost $1 million a day for every person in our country. It's unimaginable, unimaginable. We enter in this week to Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, I believe, is Wednesday. I'm not sure. It's this week, I know. Rosh Hashanah is a time of remembering. And we remember the victims of 9/11. We remember the victims who died that day. But we should also remember the victims of Afghanistan. 111,000 Afghanistani civilians have died in the war since 2009. Before 2009, they didn't even count the civilian deaths. But after 2009, they began recording civilian deaths. 111,000 civilians died in that war. And so as we remember 9/11 in this season of Rosh Hashanah, as we remember them, the victims of the towers and the Pentagon in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, the crash, as we remember those, let us also remember 111,000 and more civilians in Afghanistan. It's awfully easy in this age of imperialism. It's awful easy for us to worship ourselves, to see ourselves as the savior of the world, to see ourselves of doing no wrong, to see ourselves as the victims. In this day, in this week, I would call on us to join our Jewish friends, in remembering all. And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is not just about remembering, it is even more so about forgiveness. That's what it really is about. The reason we remember is so we'll think about forgiving. Forgiveness is the greatest power we have as human beings. It is the greatest power we have as a nation, but we've never discovered it. Forgiveness gives us healing. Dystopia. I said the sermon, the sermon changes. I have to give you by Wednesday what I'm going to do. By Friday night, it's already changed. What I wanted to talk about, kind of a dystopian smorgasbord. And give me the second slide, please. This is a Venn diagram, if you know what that is. You are here, and I'm going to add a few to it, actually, and comment on a few of them. I'm a science fiction freak. That's been my primary reading genre since I was in, we didn't call it middle school in those days, since I was in 7th grade. I read science fiction. I think there's more truth in science fiction than any other genre, to be honest with you. I'm a little prejudiced about that, but that's just the way I feel about it. I think that, science fiction, I'm not just talking about, not Buck Rogers or whatever that was in those days, or Star Wars. That's not really science fiction. That's action films. Science fiction extrapolates our present to the possibilities of the future. Everything in true science fiction comes from who we are, where we are, and what we are doing. So pick out the one you like. How many people have read 1984? I'd say an awful lot of you read 1984. Fahrenheit 451, you remember that one? Clockwork Orange, I haven't read the book, I did see the movie. Brave New World is another one. Soylent Green. A Handmaid's Tale, which is really prescient these days. And Logan's Run. Brazil and Gattaca, I don't know. Animal Farm, The Matrix, those others. But I want to point you also to the earliest science fiction that I know of, the book of Ezekiel. Most biblical prophecy is really scientific genre. It's extrapolating the present and saying, this is not telling the future, it is telling the possibilities that might arise out of the future. That's why Hosea could say, because you've trusted in the size of your chariots and the multitude of your warriors. It's simply a logical extension of what happens. And that's what science fiction generally is. It's an extrapolation of our present reality to discover the logical implications therein. Two differences, and I think really 1984 and Brave New World are two I want to talk a little bit about today. I think Brave New World is really more directly where we are than 1984. I remember in 1984 when Reagan was president, I thought, by God, we're living in 1984. I almost wish we could go back and get Reagan again these days. I did for at least 4 years. I never thought it could get worse, to be honest with you. And I want to also say that I'm an equal opportunity protester. The first president I ever protested was Jimmy Carter, although I consider him the best president we've had. I think he's probably the best. He didn't bomb anybody, and I respected that. But I protested him anyway. It was the first time when he brought back the draft registration for the draft, me and 6 women chained ourselves up in the Kansas City post office to protest. And Jimmy was smarter than most presidents. He ordered that no arrests be made the whole day. And so people just came in and looked at us and thought we were strange, but we didn't get arrested. The difference between Orwell and Brave New World of Huxley. Neil Postman has a wonderful essay called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. And he says, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared is that there would be no reason to ban books, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell's a hard word for me to say. I've a lifetime speech impediment. Sorry. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny fail to take into account humanity's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate would ruin us. Huxley feared that what we loved would ruin us. Now, I'm on Facebook. I use Facebook, to be honest with you. I limit my minutes on Facebook. I try to limit it to most a half hour at a time. And then I get up and go do something else. But, clickbait it's like, I like to fish. And I watch the fish when I'm fishing sometimes. You can see them in our lake because the water's so clear. And you can see them swimming around that lure. And they're all just mesmerized, looking at it. And I think sometimes that's how I am on Facebook. I'm looking at things, and all of a sudden something hits it and I click. It's clickbait. You got to click on that one. We got people all over this country. We got a nation that's addicted to clickbait. It's addicted to it. Distraction. That's what Huxley feared the most, is the fact that we don't have to ban books. Who reads books? And I know you all read books, but I'm talking about our country as a nation. We have lost the art of reading and interpreting what's going on around us because all of a sudden we're flooded with distraction. Click on it, you can get it. The other, by the way, early science fiction is also the Revelation of John, sometimes called the Apocalypse. Pure science fiction. I mean, John knew that the empire would persecute the early Christians. The early Christians refused to pay taxes because of war. The early Christians shared everything. The early Christians built communities that refused to obey the empire. John knew they were going to catch hell for that. But he also knew that in the end, they would win. That nonviolence, that love and compassion, that sharing, that community was more powerful than the empire. John believed that. And indeed, in terms of the Roman Empire, it proved to be true. In Brave New World, Huxley says, it isn't only art that is incompatible with happiness, it's also science. Science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled. Science is dangerous. I wonder, I saw, speaking of Facebook, somebody posted a thing, when will we achieve herd intelligence? That's a good question. It's a good question. Glenda had an experience this past week in which, can I tell this story? Her older brother sitting with her mother at the table. She's 94 years old. Her older brother's unvaccinated, doesn't wear a mask, hauls Amish all over the country, none of them wear masks. And in the conversation, which I don't think Glenda will mind, he's like a lot of older brothers, and I grew up with him too, where the older brother talks all the time. The older brother has the most important things to say and knows more than any of the rest of the siblings, and so you don't get a chance. And after talking for a while, he said, I want to share the email I sent to a friend of his who had COVID. And he's taken ivermectin. I teased him about getting rid of worms, and Glenda just said, I don't want to hear that nonsense. It kind of stopped him in his tracks because he's not used to people saying that. But here, he said, well, his doctor prescribed it. I mean, was his doctor a veterinarian, for crying out loud? A doctor prescribes that, and President Biden addressed that in his speech this last week, talking to doctors. You're the most trusted member of the health providers in the country. You need to tell people. You need to tell them the truth. But doctors are prescribing ivermectin. Science doesn't count anymore. When I grew up, my mother and dad were holiness people. We lived, it was very fundamentalist, not a fundamentalist. Yeah, it was been fundamentalist in those days. They didn't call it evangelicalism. They call it the holiness movement. But Mom and Dad appreciated science. They appreciated education. They wanted me to go to college. They didn't like some of the results of that, my theology, but they still respected, Dad had a 6th grade education, but he appreciated my going to school, and he believed in science. And so did Mom. These days, why trust a scientist? Why trust people who've spent their life studying epidemiology? Why trust a woman who spent 8 years of her life developing vaccines for COVID viruses? And they say, you hear all the Fox News saying they just developed this overnight. That is pure bovine excrement. That's what it is. It wasn't developed overnight at all. This woman studied that virus, the COVID virus, for over 8 years, and when they found the DNA of COVID-19 or whatever it is, it's 19, and she spent 48 straight hours matching that to her research. And that's where the virus, the vaccination came from. 8.5 years of her life. And yet because of the lies, because of the distraction, because of the inability to read and appreciate science or art or anything else, we have a large segment of our population who simply doesn't believe it. Huxley says in his book, but that's the price we have to pay for stability. You've got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. He also said round pegs and square holes, this is in A Brave New World, round pegs and square holes tend to have dangerous thoughts about the social system and tend to infect others with their discontents. We need more round pegs. You need to be a round peg in the square holes of this society. You need to infect your neighbors, your friends, with some discontent about who we are as a people. The moral is, William Golding said in The Lord of the Flies, that the shape of a society must depend on the ethical nature of the individual and not on any political system, however apparently logical or respectable. The shape of a society depends on the ethical nature of the individual. That to me that's what existentialism is for me. It is what I have to deal with life as I find it, and I have to do so in an ethical manner. The Jewish tradition gives us a week, a holy week, to think about that, to remember, and to forgive, because forgiveness is ethical. Now, I said as a smorgasbord, I've got Brave New World in 1984 and Lord of the Flies. I want to say another one a little bit about The Handmaid's Tale. Texas and Indiana legislators are now considering the same law for Indiana. If you have how many people's read The Handmaid's Tale? If you haven't read it, I really highly recommend it, by Margaret Atwood. The author of The Handmaid's Tale has said, states that ban abortion should pay for prenatal care, very expensive deliveries, health insurance, and the upkeep of the child after it is born. That's where the concern seems to cut off with these people, she says. Once you take your first breath, it's out the window with you. Who's going to pay for the orphans and the dead women? It is really a form of slavery to force women to have children that they cannot afford and force them to raise them. It's a form of slavery. It is making chattel out of women, that their primary purpose is to provide fodder for industry, for war, for the system. And it's interesting that abortion was never a political issue. Not for the Catholic. The Catholic Church had a position on abortion early on, but it was always after the quickening of the child. And of course, abortions were very common in the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. Abortions happened. Birth in those days was in the hands of women. It was not in the hands of male doctors or male politicians. Women took care of those issues. And it was the women who knew when they were pregnant. And it was the women who knew when it was time to have a child and when it was a bad time to have a child. And it was the women who made the decisions. Abortion became a political issue only when the Republican Party wanted to stop Jimmy Carter from a second term. And the reason was not abortion at all. The reason was segregation. And you can find this out by tracing the legislation and the political action of the Republican Party and Paul Weyrich, the brainchild behind us the pro-life movement. What happened was that the Supreme Court ruled that you could not, and the administration filed and the Supreme Court supported it, that schools that segregated, could not be tax-free. And that meant there were fundamentalist religious schools all around the country who refused to accept black kids, schools, colleges, and others. And suddenly they were about to lose. Bob Jones University was the biggest one. It was against Bob Jones that the case was settled. And Bob Jones University decided when it was settled that they were going to lose their tax exemption. They allowed one student to work in their radio station, and he only lasted one semester. Then they only allowed married black students because they were afraid blacks and white might date. But the real reason behind the modern pro-life movement was not abortion at all. The real reason was segregation. They wanted the right, religious schools wanted the right, and the right to black integrated schools. And the reason they jumped on the pro-life movement is because, or created it, was Paul Weyrich believed that would be the political movement that would beat Jimmy Carter. And he went to Jerry Falwell, and from then on, the right-wing evangelical so-called church. It's not evangelical at all, because evangelical means giving good news, and there's nothing good news about it. It's a gospel of hate. It's a gospel of not of inclusion. It's a gospel of domination, of women in particular. Carlos Chapman has written, if a fetus is a person at 6 weeks pregnant, is that when the child support starts? Is that also when you can't deport the mother because she's carrying a U.S. citizen? Can I insure a 6-week fetus and collect if I miscarry? Just figuring out where we're going here, we should go all in. Shane Claiborne, I think I have one more. Shane Claiborne, a wonderful evangelical Christian man, young man. He was here for our executions, protesting with us, and I'm trying to get him to come up to visit this year. A very simple living man and his wife, and he went to a very conservative college, as I did, and came out very, very radical. Very, very Christian, the kind of Christianity I respect with all my heart. He says there are 120,000 U.S. children waiting for an adoptive family. There are over 3,500 in Texas alone. The average wait for a child in foster care to be adopted is 3 years. Imagine if every pro-life Christian cared as much about life after birth as life before birth. This is not a religious movement, this pro-life movement. It is a political movement. And it is creating an underclass, primarily of the poor, because the rich can do anything they want, whether it's drugs, abortions, whatever. If you're rich, you can get what you want. primarily against the poor. Now, one final screen. I think I have one more. James Baldwin says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. There's a lot of pain that is underneath this radical right-wing craziness that's going on. A lot of pain, and it's real pain. It's people who have been left out of the economy. It's been people who have been promised a lot and given little. And I understand their hate from that perspective because they hate what's going on. They hate a situation in which they can't find good work, they can't get health insurance, and the fact is that many of our liberal politicians over the years have kind of made fun of them, and I think that's to the discredit of the liberal politicians. We need to be meeting the needs of the people rather than just writing them off as stupid and ignorant and so forth. But the reason they cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And we as a nation have a lot of pain to deal with. I thought a little bit this week about the stages of death, stages of grief. The first one is denial. And we have a large part of our nation is in denial about the death of the American dream, and it's dead. The American dream changed from being getting health care and having a job so you could send your kids to college and so you could have a place of security. The American dream in the 70s and 80s began to be, remember the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? That became the American dream for people. Who wants to be a millionaire? As if that's what America is here for. And when it doesn't happen, when you can't pay your bills, when you can't find housing, that's where the pain sets in. But you don't want to accept the fact that dream early on. And I want to say something here. The veterans of World War II did very well. There was a time when the United States did a lot of good social things. Social Security, the GI Bill, and those people who got those benefits ought to remember before then. They ought to remember where they came from instead of hanging on to them and saying nobody else gets them anymore. It's socialism. They don't call it socialism when you spend $300,000 a day or $300 million a day to kill people. It's socialism if you give people free education, free health care, free lunches. That's socialism. Well, give me a bunch of it. That's what I say. Give me a bunch of socialism. An old Turkish proverb says, the forest was shrinking, but trees kept voting for the axe. For the axe was clever and convinced the trees that because his handle was made of wood, he was one of them. The axe was clever. Donald Trump was clever. He convinced the white underclass that he was one of them, really. I'm the working man's president. I'd love to shake his hand. It's a hand that's never had a blister on it. I remember going to times I've traveled in Central America. I don't know how many times I would shake hands with an indigenous person down there, and they would stop and say, "Oh, you're a working person." And I was glad of that. But the working class in America got fooled in 2016 by a failed millionaire who couldn't even make money off casinos, but convinced them that he was one of them. The axe convinced the trees that he was one of them because he was wood. We have a job to do. We have a nation to save. We have a world to heal. And it all depends, as Huxley said, on the integrity of the individual. And so I'll leave you with one last thought. What are we to do in these crazy times? This is a little flyer I found called Buddha's 4 Noble Truths for a 4-year-old. Sometimes people sometimes people feel sad. Sometimes the things that make people sad is not getting something they want or getting something they don't want. There is a way not to be so sad about not getting what you want or getting something you don't want. The way is to not think so much about what you want at all, but instead think about how you can be kind and helpful to your family, to your teachers, your friends, other people, animals, bugs, and everything that lives. Be kind. I believe with all my heart, really, that integrity begins with a kindness. When the Dalai Lama says, "My only religion is kindness," that's the kind of religion I want. And there are times for righteous indignation. There are times to stand forcefully for what we believe. But always, always is a time for kindness. If we reach out with kindness and love, I believe we have the power to change the world. And I also believe if we understand that the pain we feel is not really given to us by the people we meet every day on the street, by the people in front of us. It's a systemic pain, and we cannot heal it by hating. We have to deal with that pain. It is, I encourage you to read science fiction. There's just so much out there. I could talk for hours on science fiction. I love it. Frank Herbert's one of my best. I got to talk with him several years ago, and Dune is his weakest work, in my opinion, and he agreed with me. It's good. It was good. It made him a lot of money, and it makes good movies, or bad movies. But his greatest book, I think, was The Dispossessed, and he thought I was the only person he'd ever met that had read it. I was the only person he'd ever met, and he said nobody ever read the book, and it is my greatest book. Not The Dispossessed, it's the Dasada Experiment. The Dispossessed is Ursula Le Guin. Dasada, D-A-S-A-D-A, the Dasada Experiment. And by the way, The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin is absolutely wonderful. I encourage you to read. I encourage you to work on the integrity of your own life and try to do all that you do in kindness and love, speaking truth to power, but never out of hate. Blessed be. What's the closing hymn, Glenda? Number 6, thank you.
Just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life. Though with pain I make my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Just as long as vision lasts, I must answer yes to truth. In my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to truth. Just as long as my heart beats, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. If they ask what I did best, tell them I said yes to love.
And our closing words are the number, please.
698.
Thank you. 698. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage. From deep down, there is another truth. You are not alone. Blessed be.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace, know that you are loved, and that your life is sacred.